Hello and thanks for watching this LifeSolve video. I'm Robin Montague, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers who are sharing their work in the latest series of the LifeSolve podcast. And this is work that's changing our world for the better in all sorts of ways. Today we explore the role democracy plays in a time of uncertainty, both here in the UK and around the world. I'm joined by Leila Choukroune, Professor of International Law and Director of the university's Democratic Citizenship theme, and Dr. Daniel Bedford, Programme Lead in the university's School of Law, whose research focuses on the protection of human dignity in human rights law. They're the perfect pair to unpack a growing trend in democracies around the world that many fear could restrict our personal freedoms. Events of recent months have certainly brought this debate into even sharper focus. So, Leila and Daniel, thank you very much for joining me today. How about we start then with what inspired you both to get into the area of research that you're in, so international law and human rights? Leila, do you want to start?
You know, I've always had a quite critical and inquisitive mind, and I studied political sciences and law and international law. My PhD was about China and the World Trade Organization at the time of China's accession to the organization. And of course, at the time I started to work on the Chinese regime, democracy and non-democracy, the rule of law. And then I moved to Indian democracy, and later to East Africa. So I've always sort of interrogated the concept of democracy within my research on international law and indeed a number of global South countries.
And you said you've always had an interest in democracy. Was that from a really young age? Was there anything in particular growing up that kind of caught your attention when it came to that?
I suppose so. I think at a very young age I wanted to become a politician, and then I realised what it was, and I thought, well, maybe not.
Probably didn't suited what you're after.
Exactly that.
And what about you, Daniel?
My interest in human rights began in my undergraduate studies, so it was by far the subject I was interested in most. A lot of my colleagues were very interested in corporate law and company law and all these sorts of areas, but I was very interested in the human rights side of things. And after my undergraduate, I went and worked in Uganda, Rwanda and Kenya for several months with a human rights NGO working with prisoners out there in these countries. And that kind of just further kind of made me interested in the area, and I then came back and did an international human rights law master's at the University of Exeter, and then followed that up with my PhD. So I've always found human rights very, very interesting.
And I suppose you said there that it was when you went to other countries that it really, I suppose, it put into perspective democracy around the world and how it changes.
Yeah, and sometimes different ways of doing democracy, or sometimes lack of democracy. So in some of the places that I went to, I saw a great deal of corruption in the way in which society was being run. So that in some ways undermines democratic society.
I suppose for this conversation, because we're LifeSolve, we like to really tackle subjects that may be fairly complicated, but break them apart and make them digestible for our audience. Democracy in itself is quite a big term. It has a very big meaning. Should we just explain what that means at its core? What is democracy?
You may have seen in September, the Open Society Foundation released a study telling us, based on 30 different countries, you can say only 30 countries, but telling us that, good sign, 86% of the respondents would prefer to live in a democracy. And 85% of the respondents support human rights. They would like to live in a country where human rights are implemented. Yet, in the same study, we find that 58% of the youngsters, so we're talking about people between the age of 18 and 35, support military regime and would like to support a sort of strong leader for 35% of them. This is actually quite worrying, because you might think, well, youngsters should support democracy and human rights more, right? But it's actually not the case. So this begs the question of education. We are a university, so surely there's a lot for us to do in terms of conveying and explaining the message, what's democracy, and why is it that youngsters support military regime and strong leaders? What do they see in that? You may have seen as well that we have a number of other studies, including from the UN, questioning the decline of democracy based on a number of indicators: freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom to demonstrate. We're going to talk about that later. We are referring to countries like Hungary, countries like China, countries like Russia, but also to our own democracies, where it seems that democracy is going backward. Is it really the case? And to explain that, we have to look back at the concept of democracy. So what is democracy? As you all know probably, it comes from the Greek, demos, and kratos, right? So, or krasia, demos, the people, and krasia, power. So that would mean that people have the power, or the sovereignty is embedded within the people. So you all think about Athens, 5th century BCE, but actually at the time, the democracy in Athens was very different from today's democracy. We had a question of space, where, who, people, and how. So space, that was actually limited to a city. So certainly not a country, but rather a city. Then who? Who could benefit from democracy? The citizens. But who was a citizen? Only 15%, 15% of the population. Why was that? Because women were excluded. Slaves were excluded, and you had lots of slaves at that time in Athens, and foreigners were excluded. And then how? In terms of tools, in institution, you had the agora, you had assemblies, but something really far away from today's democracy.
So when you package it like that, to me it sounds like, well, this is a fantastic thing, you know, giving people the power. But then you say that, was it more than half of young people would prefer a different approach, which to me would suggest that maybe they feel that democracy is failing us in some way, which we'll obviously get onto in a bit more detail in a minute. But Daniel, is there anything else you want to add about democracy and your thoughts, what Leila said?
I mean, Leila's set out an excellent summary there of what democracy is. But I think something I'd like to just make clear is a distinction between a very kind of narrow view of democracy as what we call majoritarian democracy. Democracy is whatever the majority wants. Through elections, they vote for a majority party. The majority party makes a decision. That is the democratic outcome. Whereas you can see democracy as a much, I guess, thicker concept, a much more detailed concept that protects our rights as well as whatever the majority wants. So in a true democracy, perhaps that's based on equality, we might recognize the rights of minorities and that we have to protect those rights from what we would call the tyranny of the majority. So something like that.
I suppose that plays into what Leila said about, you know, back in Greece and
Absolutely.
Athens, there were certain areas of, you know, the community or people like women or slaves who weren't included in that. And that is still, we find that the case, or the issue now is that a lot of minority voices seem to be excluded from democracy or the rights of democracy.
Well, indeed, and there is no such thing as a perfect democracy. This is also a quite evolving concept. So from the 6th century BCE in India or 5th century in Athens to today, we had different forms of regime, even in the late 19th century, early 20th century in Europe and in North America, democracies were quite different to the democracies we have today. So we have to bear in mind that there's a sort of pendulum swing and waves of democracy. So late 19th century, you had a number of new democratic countries, mostly in Europe. Think about the 60s, 1960s, post-decolonization, a number of new countries, democratic countries indeed, in Africa, in Latin America. And then another wave of non-democratic countries. So it's not because you're a democracy one day that you always remain a democracy. So this is also something really interesting to think about, and which explains probably the frustration of the younger generation, which thinks that what do we have today? Do we live better? Our rights, our freedom, our identity, and I think we'll get back to the question of identity because it really relates to the crisis of democracy. Is our identity understood in our democratic societies? Are we again living better? Do we have economic power? Is life easy? It is not, because somehow it is relatively complicated economically speaking for a number of years, so this also plays a part.
And I think something which we touched on about, you know, freedom of expression or freedom of rights and things, what walks hand in hand with democracy in my mind is the right to protest. And I imagine a lot of people would put the two together. The history of protest is quite a long one, though. It's been around for centuries. Could you just give us an example of give us a couple of examples of some protests and also maybe a bit of the history about it?
Well, I can certainly give examples of recent protests.
Yes,
We've just
it
seen,
seems
of
very
course,
topical at the moment.
I mean, at the weekend we saw during Armistice Day the protests in favour of Palestine and in favour of ceasefire in between Israel and the Gaza Strip. So that is obviously a very, very recent protest. And then also recently, we've always had the Black Lives Matters protests and the Arab Spring. That was a fight for democracy in a number of different countries. So these are just some examples. I don't know if you wanted to...
Well, yes, of course. And these are examples which are very useful and easy to understand for people, who are watching us or listening to us, because they can relate to these very recent events. But as you said, Robin, the idea of protesting, expressing your voice, right, expressing your opinion is something which relates to democracy for sure, but which always existed. So you oppose the king, you oppose the sovereign, you oppose the state, simply because you want to voice your concerns about taxation, about freedom of movement, and so on and so forth. As we said before, democracy is based on a set of institutions and rights. The freedom to protest, the freedom to express your views is part of them, right? And is generally recognized at the highest sort of legal level and in the Constitution often. The problem here again is that it's not necessarily set in stone, although I just said that it's recognized in the Constitution, but it doesn't mean that it's always respected, always implemented. And there's always the need to fight for these rights, to remind the state, whatever the state is, whoever the state is, that you as the people have rights, and to remind the state that it is also accountable. That's what we call the rule of law. So democracy and the rule of law, very complex. We could talk about different political, philosophers from Kelsen to others, but it goes hands in hand, and at the same time, sometimes it's a bit contradictory. Because you may say that you have the rule of law in a formal way, so a set of institutions, a set of law. So I give you the example of China. At one point, China in the 90s and early 2000s was arguing that they had the rule of law because indeed you have courts, you had a constitution, you had all sorts of laws. And yet, of course, it was not a democracy, right? So there's this element of formalism, if you wish. So the right to protest is something to understand within this general context as a right, but a right which is not absolute, because our rights, human rights, are not absolute, and a right which is often challenged by the state for various reasons. One of the reasons is the idea of public order. We've heard that quite a lot recently in a number of countries, including in the UK. Public order. So it would mean that security would be more valued than a number of other freedoms, right? For what reason? Is it even legal? It can be if we feel that the state existence, to some extent, is threatened by terrorist group. Let's take the 9/11 example. You all remember that after 9/11, a number of measures were taken into consideration and put in place by the US, by France, by the UK, most of the countries, to justify the intervention of the states to protect us against terrorism. Remember COVID-19, that was the same. So the state of exception at that time was argued in favor of security and, on the contrary, to a number of rights. We didn't have the right to move, right? So it seems far away, but it's not far away.
I mean, the COVID-19 protest raises some interesting issues because it's not just, of course, public order that was in play there. It was the protection of the rights of people to protest, but on the other hand, also potentially the protection of the rights to life of individuals. Absolutely. Because, of course, there's the risks of spreading the disease, which is, there was an interesting debate and discussion about the balancing of different rights in those circumstances. And I think this is going back to what Leila set out at the beginning. The right to protest, which is protected under the European Convention of Human Rights, given effect in UK via the Human Rights Act, is not absolute. So it is a limited right. There are circumstances where it can be restricted, but any restriction has to be proportionate. Exactly. And that has to be also, and this is the terminology, necessary in a democratic society. So if you're going to limit the right to protest, it has to meet this democratic standard as well.
You said it has to meet this standard, but who is making that call that it's met that standard? Because there have been restrictions on our rights to protest here in the UK fairly recently. So just explain what has happened there. What are our current rights when it comes to protest? And who makes that call?
That's an interesting question about the call. But I mean, I'll just explain perhaps the developments of recent years. So we had a new piece of legislation passed in 2022, which introduced new restrictions on the right to protest, and enables the police to place restrictions on the routes and when protests can be held, and various other aspects of protest. It can be applied wherever there is a concern that there be a serious disruption to the life of the community from that protest. And a serious disruption means anything that's more than minor that might interfere with day-to-day activities, or it might interfere with the delivery of time-sensitive products. It might also encompass anything that is a more than minor disruption to the access to essential goods and services. So this is a quite expansive range of circumstances where the police can recognise that a situation is going to disrupt the life of the community. So previously, we'd already had law in place that enabled the police to place conditions on protests if there was a serious disruption to the life of the community. But what has happened is this legislation has begun to define what constitutes a serious disruption, and it's something that's more than minor in relation to these various things that I've mentioned. So it's a much wider, I think, range of circumstances now where the police can interfere with the right to protest. The other situations now are in relation to noisy protests. Protests that cause serious disruption to an organisation, or might cause alarm or distress to passers-by because their protests are too noisy, would be recognised as something that is also capable of being prohibited by the police. Of course, this raises concerns. I mean, protests are usually by definition noisy. They're about raising our voice and having our voice heard. And of course, if a particular cause is attracting a larger number of people, you would expect that cause to be more noisy because there's more people, right? So it is interesting that this is what has happened, and there are of course very serious concerns that it is interfering with the rights of individuals, as Leila was talking about earlier, to have their voices expressed on significant issues of public concern, for minorities to be able to express their right to be treated as equals in society, and all of these other sorts of issues.
And we obviously touched on briefly about, the role of law when it comes to democracy and protest, the right to protest. I just want to flag where we're actually filming this today. We're in a replica courtroom here at the University of Portsmouth, Anglesey building. Definitely worth checking out if you're interested in studying law. It's amazing. You actually feel like you're in some sort of episode of CSI. So I did ask about, who makes that call when it comes to...
I skirted over
it. But is it, arguably in a democracy, is it in some wayward way supposed to be the people making that call, I suppose, because they...
Well, I think this is a really important point. So first of all, I should have said that the legislation that was created in 2022 gave the power to the government, to ministers, to define what a serious disruption was to the public. And so some of what I've just mentioned was introduced by the government, not through the democratic process, but bypassing it, okay? And that's one of the big concerns about this particular legislation. The other thing is, if it is set down in legislation, it is created by a majority decision-making process. It goes back to my point earlier. Does that necessarily mean that the outcome is democratic if what the law does is it restricts the ability for people to be able to express their opinions on matters of public concern? One of the biggest concerns, I think, with this legislation, and we've seen it in the last week or so, is how vague and broad it is. And this leads to problems with the government potentially being able to apply pressure on the police. So we saw at the weekend this idea that the police, the Metropolitan Police, could be pressurised into restricting this protest that happened at the weekend on the basis that they should be using the powers that they have been given to prevent this from taking place. And this is clearly concerning, because the role of the police is to enforce the law, going back to the rule of law. It's not to enforce the political will of the dominant party in government. And so this is, I think, one of the concerns about this particular type of legislation, is that it creates space for the application of this kind of pressure in a way that doesn't restrict the power sufficiently, and there's a danger there to suppressing or chilling speech.
What Daniel just said is absolutely fascinating and very important to understand. This is something we observe in the UK, but actually everywhere in the world, including Western democracies. There is a greater role for the executive. You remember that we have, logically, 3 branches of government, right? Executive, legislative, and judiciary. So instead of giving more force, more power to the parliament, to simplify, we observe that the executive, the government, is taking more and more important decisions. Not only in neo-authoritarian countries, but in our democracies. And this becomes really complicated for law enforcement authorities, the police. Because the police is supposed, as Dan rightly say, to enforce the law. But what's the law then?
So the police's role then has quite a significant one in this, because they're, like you say, they're being told to adhere to the law, but are also given additional powers to restrict things that you think would be a person's right.
Yes, so if you define the circumstances in which the police can interfere broadly enough, then you can complain if the police don't then enforce what it is you want them to do, which is, I think, partly what we saw in the last week. But it also creates the potential for misuse and abuse of power by the police, because if they're dealing with very vague laws that could potentially apply to a wide range of circumstances, they might then resort to using those powers in an inappropriate way, because they may not understand the scope or limits of their powers. So, for example, during the King's coronation, and there were some protests during that, there were incidents or reports of people being threatened with arrest by holding up signs saying "Not my king." And if you're thinking about democracy and the ability of people to be able to claim that this is not for them a genuine democracy, the society they live in, and we would probably see that as an important form of speech, and that should be protected. We saw also during that there was arrests of some volunteers at 2 a.m. on the day of the protest, because there were women handing out rape alarms, and the police arrested them on the suspicion that they were going to, or those alarms were going to be used as part of the protest to disrupt it. Okay, and it's that sort of potential concern there. They're misusing powers. They had to apologise afterwards, because there was absolutely no basis on which that was true in this case. These women were obviously out at 2 a.m. providing these rape alarms to help others to remain safe. But these are just examples of where if you allow vague laws that enable the police a wide discretion to determine when something is illegal or not, then you create that room for an abuse of power, and you create that space for the police to make decisions that I think many of us would find very concerning. So I think that's something I'd add to what we've said already, please.
And it's interesting when you say, you mentioned free speech there particularly. Like we said at the beginning, democracy in itself, it should be power to the people. And when you restrict their ability to even voice their concerns or voice their opinions, that's where democracy, I suppose, begins to fail. Do you think that's the case, Leila? Do you think there's a really important aspect of democracy is free speech?
Absolutely. This is certainly very important. And again, it's strange that the youngsters do not understand that, because they're keen to express their voices, right? So there is a lot of confusion in terms of concept at the moment. Why do we want to have strong regimes? Is it a strong regime that you can express your voice? Probably not, right? And so much so that we have to reflect upon some sort of categories. There's a term which is really interesting and I'd like to bring to the discussion, the terms of illiberalism. So, of course, everybody understands liberalism. illiberalism, something which looks like liberal democracy, but it's not. And this comes actually from a book published in 1995 by Daniel Bell, who happens to be a philosopher who works on China. And looking at China and East Asia, he coined this term, which I think is really interesting again, because it says a lot about formalism. You remember we mentioned formalism before. So basically, in these illiberal democracies, you do have the forms, you do have the institution of democracies, but they are just a mere fact, a mere screen to hide undemocratic practices, including indeed the restriction of freedom of speech, the restriction of freedom of press, for instance, which happened a lot in a number of countries, and democracies. For instance, India, a massive democracy, a model democracy to some extent, has gone so much down in terms of freedom of press. It seems to me that it's 166 or something like that on the ranking of freedom of press in the world. And again, India is not an exception. This is something happening a bit everywhere in the world. So this idea of ill democracy is really interesting. Until recently, we used this term for China, Russia, Hungary, Viktor Orban, Turkey with Erdogan, and so on and so forth. But today, it seems almost applicable to our democracies.
Can I just ask a question on that? Do you think illiberal democracy is actually possible? Is there such a thing as an illiberal democracy, or is democracy only ever democracy if it is liberal?
Well, we have to define that. What's liberalism, right? Liberalism can be many, many things. It can be used in a very common way, and everybody would think about capitalism rather than, the political system of liberalism. But I think illiberal democracy is a democracy based on the form, the institution, rather than the rights, and the liberal rights, including and particularly the political and civil rights. Because in these illiberal democracies, in Asia, for instance, you would have historically, based on their socialist past, for instance, more emphasis on social and economic rights rather than on political and civil rights. So the right to vote, the right to, again, express your opinions, and so on and so forth.
It's interesting you say that. I mean, you're absolutely right that in illiberal democracies there is an erosion of rights protection, but it's not just rights, it's also things like judicial independence.
Absolutely.
So in Poland and Hungary, they've seen reforms to their judicial system, which erodes the independence of the judiciary, which means that more power can be exercised and influence can be exercised over those judges by the politicians in a way that means that there's less accountability, which is, of course, something that we would consider, I think, probably an important facet of democracy.
Very much so. And we had a recent decision from the British Supreme Court, which goes against, the political decision of establishing this Rwanda scheme, right, for immigrants or refugees. And it shows the power still of our democracies. If we have active, independent judiciaries, they're here to balance the political force, if you wish. And this is something a country like China doesn't have. They don't have an independent judiciary.
And just for anyone who isn't based in the UK, you mentioned about Rwanda. What's actually, just to give a brief explanation to our listeners about what's happening with that?
Yes. So the UK government had wanted to adopt a policy that would enable them to deport individuals entering the UK via illegal means, including via boats, to Rwanda. Where their asylum claim would be processed and they would claim asylum in Rwanda rather than claiming it here. And yesterday, the UK Supreme Court found that that was unlawful. It was unlawful in relation to Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights, but also under the Refugee Convention, because these instruments protect against what's called non-refoulement. So if you return a person to a country where there's a risk that that person would then be deported again back to a country where they might be subject to torture or persecution, then that's something that's precluded under the law. And so the Supreme Court was enforcing that law by saying that Rwanda is not a safe country. If you were to deport people to Rwanda, there's a real risk that they could then be deported to a country, perhaps a country of origin, where they may be subjected to torture or some other kind of serious harm.
There is so many layers to this conversation. We could be here for hours talking about it, and it is incredibly interesting. I'm sure our listeners want to know more, but because of time restrictions, I think it would be quite good to wrap up really with this. We're just looking to the future. Democracy in itself, we've spoken about how there's a fear that it's in decline or it's failing, but what can be done, in your opinions, to get to a point where actually we have a bit of trust in democracy and young people, again, for instance, actually want to see democratic societies thrive?
Yes, so maybe, Robin, we can say that there's nothing perfect in democracy. It's not the most perfect regime, but as we often say, maybe it's the best we have until now because of this combination between institutions and rights, and it's the best to protect us as individuals and to make our voices heard. So for the youngsters in particular, we started with this sort of alarming statistic where do believe in what you have if you're lucky enough to live in a democratic country, engage with the political life of your country, try to be creative and dynamic to propose rights and freedom, to support them, and again engage more with your daily life. And daily life is not only about practicalities and materialistic life, but think about concepts, think about ideas and concepts do matter a lot.
And Daniel?
I said a very, very big question. I think when voting and when making a choice at an election, I would be very inclined to say make sure that you're choosing a party that's going to protect democracy. I know that sounds a bit of an odd thing to say, but we're looking at things like the United States, and we're seeing the threats, I think, to the democratic institutions of that country, and that a vote is not just a vote between two different parties. A vote for a party that may, or a particular individual who may undermine or begin to undermine democracy. So that's something I would note. In terms of how we can enhance democracy, there's obviously been a lot of discussion around devolution, whether or not we need more devolution, whether we need more democratic institutions at a local level, in the United Kingdom, for example. And I'd like to consider further whether or not that would enhance people's trust in the institutions of democracy.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for talking with me today. It's been really interesting. Just to note as well, this was recorded on Thursday, the 16th of November. There have been some time references, and obviously democracy continues to change on a daily basis. Exactly. There's always something else happening in the news, so just want to make that clear what date we're on. The growing distrust towards governments and leaders across the world has left many fearing democracy is in decline, as we've spoken about today. But despite people experiencing restrictions to their human rights and freedoms, the world is still more democratic than it was half a century ago, and I think that's important to mention. If you'd like to listen to our full episode of Life Solved, exploring the powers of democracy and also protest, then head to the University of Portsmouth website or download it on your favourite podcast app now. You can click the link in the comments box below, or you can also head to port.ac.uk/research to find out a little bit more about the research that we've been talking about here today and the Portsmouth Law School and this amazing replica courtroom. We're taking a short Christmas break and we'll be back in the new year for the final 2 episodes of the series. Expect a deep dive into 2 things that may be on our minds in the new year: addiction and the cost of living crisis. So see you then.